Hello, this is a video of me talking about my favorite horror films that came out in the 1990s. Now, I just want to make it clear that these are my personal favorites. Not all of these might necessarily be the best horror films that came out in the 1990s. Admittedly, some of these movies really aren't the best, but they're movies that I personally love, and nostalgia does play a factor with a lot of these movies. But some of the movies on this list are movies that I genuinely think are good movies, but some of them are more guilty pleasures. The first movie I want to talk about is Maniac Cop 2, which I personally think is the best of the Maniac Cop trilogy. Now, the Maniac Cop movies, this is a series that I sort of just discovered this past summer. Like, I've known about the movies for years, but I saw them for the first time this past summer, and personally, I think this is the best of the three movies, but I personally like all three Maniac Cop movies, but once again, I think this one is the best. Now, if you want to know more of my thoughts on this movie and the other two films in this series, I did a review of all three Maniac Cop movies this past October. The next movie on my list is Tremors, which as you can see I don't have on DVD, I have on VHS, and Tremors really is a classic movie. It's funny, it's actually really suspenseful, especially when you see the characters having to avoid the ground because of the gravoids. Like, it's a really fun movie. Now, I'll admit, it's been a number of years since I've seen this movie, but I used to watch this movie all the time when I was a little kid, and about 5 years ago now, I rewatched the movie, and from what I remember from watching it 5 years ago, it's held up pretty well, but admittedly, I do have to watch the movie again. Somebody actually asked me on Facebook a while back if I would review all the Tremors movies. That's something I've been meaning to do. I don't know if I'll get to it this October, or maybe the October after that. October, by the way, is when I usually review all the films in different horror franchises. The next movie I want to talk about is Nightbreed, which is written and directed by Clive Barker. This is the movie he did right after Hellraiser, and this is based on Clive Barker's book Cabal. Now, I have read the book, and the movie is actually pretty true to the book. Granted, it's been a couple of years since I've read the novel, but the movie does remain pretty faithful to the novel. It does change a few things, but apparently a lot of the changes that this movie does make were actually because of studio interference, because apparently the studio really did interfere with the production of this movie. Now, I haven't seen the Cabal cut, which I know came out a few years ago. Supposedly, that cut of the movie actually does follow the book a little closer than this movie does, but I still really enjoy Nightbreed. I don't like it as much as Hellraiser, but I still think it's a really fun movie, and David Cronenberg is in this movie. He plays the main villain, and Cronenberg is freaking creepy as hell in this movie, and the movie also has a weird kind of almost Tim Burton-esque kind of feel to it. Like, it almost feels like if Tim Burton directed a Clive Barker adaptation, even though there's stuff in this movie that would probably weird even Tim Burton out. The next movie on my list is Tales from the Darkside, the movie, which of course is a spin-off of the TV series Tales from the Darkside, and this is also considered to be the official third film in the Creepshow series. Now, there was a movie called Creepshow 3 years after this, but I personally discount that movie, and a lot of people involved with the first two Creepshow movies also discount that movie. This is really considered by a lot of people like Tom Savini and Stephen King and George Romero to be the official third film in the Creepshow franchise. But whether you consider this a Creepshow sequel or not, Tales from the Darkside, the movie, I think is a very underrated anthology film. Personally, this is one of my favorite anthology films, and even if you don't count this as being part of the Creepshow franchise, I would still rank this alongside the first Creepshow movie as one of the best anthology horror films. Now, my personal favorite segment in this movie is the Lover's Vows segment, which is the one with the gargoyle, but I also really liked the Cat from Hell segment, which was actually based on a short story by Stephen King. The next movie I want to talk about is Gremlins II, the new batch, which I think is a very underrated sequel. I don't like it as much as the first Gremlins movie, but the first movie is actually one of my top 5 favorite films of all time, so it's kind of hard to top that movie for me, but I still think Gremlins 2 is a very underrated film. I used to watch this movie all the time when I was a little kid, even though admittedly when I was a little kid I didn't get a lot of the jokes in this movie. As an adult rewatching the movie, there's a lot of jokes in this movie that I actually think are really clever and really subversive. And there's actually some meta jokes in this movie, and there are some jokes in this film at the expense of the first movie that are actually kind of poking fun at the plot holes of the first movie. But yeah, Gremlins 2, I don't like it as much as the first one, but it's still a very fun and very underrated sequel. And in speaking of underrated sequels, the next movie on my list is The Exorcist III, which is nowhere near as good as the original film, but here's the thing about the original The Exorcist: that is not just one of the greatest horror films of all time, but it's one of the greatest films of any genre, and it's really not a film that needed sequels, but as a sequel to The Exorcist, this is actually a pretty damn good sequel. Now, the film is written and directed by William Peter Blatty, who wrote the book that the first movie was based on, and this is actually based on Blatty's novel Legion, which was a direct sequel to the book The Exorcist. And this movie completely ignores Exorcist 2, and for good reason, because that movie sucked. Now, in between this and The Exorcist, Blatty did do a movie called The Ninth Configuration, which was sort of a spiritual sequel to The Exorcist, and both this, The Ninth Configuration, and The Exorcist are all considered to be part of Blatty's trilogy of faith, because all 3 films and the books that they're based on deal with the concept of faith. But yeah, once again, The Exorcist III is a very underrated film. Now, I still haven't seen the director's cut of this movie, which came out a few years ago, but I still like this particular cut of the film, even though it is flawed, but a lot of the flaws that this movie has are not Blatty's fault, because the studio really did interfere with this movie. But yeah, George C. Scott is amazing in this film as Lieutenant Kinderman, and Brad Dourif is in this film as the Gemini Killer, and I would rank this among one of Brad Dourif's best performances. Now, if you want to know more of my thoughts of this movie, I did do a review of it a number of years ago, and I also reviewed the book Legion a number of years ago as well. The next movie I want to talk about is the 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead, which was directed by Tom Savini, and I love this one. Now, of course, it's not as good as the original film, but the original Night of the Living Dead was such a groundbreaking movie for the time, and of course this movie was never going to top that original film, and I don't think they're trying to either. They do set out to make a different film from the original. Yes, it does have a lot of the same characters from the original, and it has the same basic story, but it is, for the most part, a different film. Now, while I don't like it as much as the original film, there are little things that this movie does almost better than the original. For example, I think Barbara in this movie is a much better character here than she was in the original Night of the Living Dead, and to a certain extent, I almost like Tony Todd's take on Ben more than Dwayne Jones's take on the character. Even though Dwayne Jones can never be forgotten because Night of the Living Dead was one of the first movies that featured a black man as the main character. So once again, this one is nowhere near as groundbreaking as the original film was, but I really don't think it's trying to be either. Now, the next movie I want to talk about, I fully admit is not a great movie, but it's a film I've always personally enjoyed, and this is one of those movies I was talking about earlier where I said nostalgia plays a major factor in terms of my feelings towards the film, but that movie is Graveyard Shift, which of course is based on a short story by Stephen King, which was published in his collection Night Shift. Now, once again, I recognize that this is not a great movie, but it's a film I've always enjoyed. I think the creature effects in the movie are actually really damn good, and Brad Dourif is in this movie, and he steals this movie from the rest of the cast, in my opinion. Once again, it's not a great film, but it's a film I've always had fun with. The next movie I want to talk about is Jacob's Ladder, which is a genuinely good movie. Now, I did do a review of this movie a number of years ago, but truth be told, I was actually thinking of taking my old review of this movie down and re-reviewing this, because I feel like I could do such a better job at reviewing this movie, because this is a movie where if I were to review it again, I would really like to do the movie a justice, because this is an amazing movie. And not just is it a great horror film, but it's also a really good drama film about PTSD. Now, the basic plotline of the movie is it's about this Vietnam vet who, after he comes back from the war, he starts having these visions where he's seeing demons, and he's not sure if these are real or if they're just hallucinations, and there is a really interesting twist in the movie, but even when you get the twist, there's still a lot left open for the viewer's interpretation. But yeah, Jacob's Ladder is a great movie, and it's also one of Tim Robbins' best performances, in my opinion. The next movie I want to talk about is Child's Play 2, which I don't like as much as the first one, but I do think Child's Play 2 is a really well done sequel. And one of the things I think is really interesting about this movie, now Andy Barclay was one of the main characters of the first movie, but really in the first film, the two main protagonists were Karen Barclay and the character of Mike Norris. In this one, this is really Andy's movie. Andy Barclay is really the main protagonist of this film, and people give Alex Vincent a lot of shit for his acting back then. Truth be told, though, I actually thought he did a really good job in this movie. Now, what's kind of funny about this movie is I was in a TV production class a few years ago, and one of the projects that we had to do for that class was direct a live show where you have a movie critic reviewing all these films, and one of the films that this movie critic was reviewing was Child's Play 2, this movie, and we actually had to show a scene from the movie, and we showed the scene where Andy Barclay is tied to the bed and Chucky's trying to transfer his soul into his body. The reason I'm bringing this up is because me and my friend met Alex Vincent a couple of years ago, and we brought that up to him, and when we mentioned that scene to him, he just said, "Oh yeah, I learned a lot about myself during the filming of that scene." But yeah, Child's Play 2, while I don't like it as much as the first one, is still a really good sequel. And then you had Child's Play 3, which I know a lot of people don't like. I've always enjoyed Child's Play 3 myself. And then you had Bride of Chucky, which is my personal favorite of the Child's Play sequels. Once again, it's not as good as the first one, but as the sequels go, this is actually my favorite of the sequels. And it's kind of funny because I think Child's Play 2 is arguably the best of the Child's Play sequels, but in terms of my own personal favorite, this is my personal favorite of the sequels. The next movie I want to talk about is It, which was a made-for-TV movie. This was actually a two-part miniseries. Now, the film is directed by Tommy Lee Wallace, who also directed Halloween 3, and of course the film is based on the Stephen King novel of the same name. Now, this is the movie that really sort of kick-started that craze in the 1990s where you had all these different made-for-TV adaptations of Stephen King's work, and some of them were good and some of them were really bad, but this is the movie that really sort of kick-started all that. I mean, you could argue Salem's Lot, but Salem's Lot came out like 11 years before this movie. I think it was really this movie that sort of started that trend. Now, I'll admit, I've been very unfair to this movie over the years, because if you know me, you know I'm a diehard fan of the book It, and honestly the book is one of my top 5 favorite novels of all time, and also I think it's Stephen King's best novel. And one of the reasons why I've been so hard on this movie over the years is because I do not think the movie does justice to the book, because this is only a 2-part miniseries, and honestly, there's so much in the book that you could probably do a 2-season TV series based on everything from the novel, and really, I think at least this should have been a 4-part miniseries, at least. That being said, however, if you just watch this as a standalone film and you don't keep in mind how much this movie left out from the book, it's actually a pretty well done movie, especially for a made-for-TV movie. And for a made-for-TV movie, especially around this time, it actually touches on some subject matter that, for the time, for a made-for-TV movie, was pretty ballsy. And I was rewatching this a while back, and honestly, I think the movie holds up pretty well. More so the first half of the movie. Admittedly, the second half of the film is not as good as the first half, but even the second half of the film I think people are way harder on than it actually deserves. Now, the plot of It is it's about this evil spirit that haunts this small town in Maine called Derry, and this spirit can take on the form of whatever a child is most afraid of, but it generally takes on the form of a clown, and when it takes on the form of a clown, it calls itself Pennywise, and the story follows this group of people who, when they were children, they defeated it, but now that they're all adults, it has come back, and they all have to return to the town to try to stop it once and for all. But once again, I actually think It is a pretty good movie. Now, as a fan of the book, I don't think it does justice to the book. At the same time, though, I understand that not everything from the book is gonna work in a movie, especially all the more outlandish stuff from the book, like the turtle and all the stuff about its origin, which directly ties in with the Dark Tower series. I understand a lot of that was definitely not gonna work for a film. And I'll admit, I've been much harder on this movie than it actually deserves, and I loved the new It movie, and there were some things about the new It film that I actually think it did better than this one, but at the same time, there are some things that this one actually did better, and I don't think either adaptation really did justice to the novel. But one thing I think this movie does do better than the new movie is, honestly, I think Pennywise in this movie is far creepier than Pennywise was in the new movie, because one of the things that made Pennywise so scary in this movie and in the book is he comes off like a regular circus clown, and when you find out that it's not even human, that's what makes it creepy, because he comes off so human in the movie, and once again, he comes off like a regular clown, and when you find out what it actually is, that makes it creepier, whereas in the new movie, and don't get me wrong, I thought Bill Skarsgård did a great job in the new movie, but in the new movie, it just comes off as more of the stereotypical evil clown. So personally, I think Tim Curry's portrayal of Pennywise is much better. And one thing I do want to point out is I was watching this movie with my little sister, and she actually made me really proud when she said that this movie creeped her out way more than the remake did. And keep in mind, she saw the remake in the theaters by herself, and she said this actually creeped her out more. The next movie I want to talk about is Predator 2, which I don't like as much as the first one, but it's still a really good sequel, and I definitely recommend it if you haven't seen this. Now, you could argue whether or not the Predator movies really are horror or not. I personally do consider them to be horror. I mean, they're definitely more sci-fi action, but here's the thing though. I don't think genre is a set-in-stone thing, and a movie can be of more than one genre at the same time. The next movie I want to talk about is Misery, which of course is based on the Stephen King novel of the same name, and this is directed by Rob Reiner, who also directed another great Stephen King adaptation, Stand By Me. But Misery is a great movie. It's scary as hell, especially if you put yourself in the character of Paul Sheldon's place, and Annie Wilkes really is one of the great Stephen King villains, and Kathy Bates does an amazing job in this movie as the character of Annie Wilkes, and James Caan is also really good in this movie as Paul Sheldon. Now, I have read the book that this movie is based on, and the movie does change a lot from the book, but I do think the movie stays pretty true to the general themes of the book. The next movie I want to talk about is The Silence of the Lambs, which as you can see I don't have on DVD, I have it on VHS. And The Silence of the Lambs, really what's there to say about this movie that hasn't already been said? This of course is a brilliant movie. Now, this is technically a sequel to Manhunter, and I do personally prefer Manhunter, but that's not taken away from Silence of the Lambs. Silence of the Lambs is still an amazing film. And even though this wasn't the first Hannibal Lecter movie, this is really the film which made Hannibal Lecter a household name. Now, people have debated endlessly whether or not this is actually a horror film. It's a horror film. Now, yes, it's also a psychological thriller, but as I mentioned when I was talking about Predator 2, genre is not a set-in-stone thing. A lot of the times, genre can be a matter of opinion, and a movie can be of more than one genre at the same time, so just because this is a psychological thriller doesn't mean it's not a horror film. It's also very much a crime drama film as well, but just because it's a crime drama film doesn't mean it's not horror. But yeah, The Silence of the Lambs, regardless of what genre you consider this movie to be, it's still an excellent film. Once again, I personally prefer Manhunter, but that's not taken away from this movie. This is still a great movie. Now we move on to a movie which admittedly is not as classy as The Silence of the Lambs, but it's still a good movie in its own right, and that is Puppet Master 3, Toulon's Revenge, which personally I think is the best film in the Puppet Master franchise. Now, all the Puppet Master movies, this one included, are cheesy, but this one I would argue has the best story out of all the Puppet Master movies. And this is the first one in the series where the puppets are outright anti-heroes, because really the main villains of this movie are the Nazis, and the puppets are actually the good guys. But yeah, if you're a fan of the Puppet Master movies, or the early Full Moon movies, I highly recommend Puppet Master 3 if you haven't seen it yet. Now, I have Puppet Master 3 on this DVD set right here featuring the first 9 Puppet Master movies. This doesn't have Puppet Master vs. Demonic Toys on it, and it doesn't have the last 2 Puppet Master movies on it. The next movie I want to talk about is a film that I'll admit is not a great movie, but it's a film I've always personally enjoyed, and that is The People Under the Stairs, which is directed by Wes Craven. Here's the thing about The People Under the Stairs. This is such a goofy movie. At the same time, though, it actually has a really powerful social message about class systems and about racism, but it's such a goofy and cheesy horror film as well. Admittedly, the film is sort of an anomaly for me. At the same time, though, I do personally enjoy the film, despite its flaws. And I have the movie on this DVD set right here where it comes with 2 other Wes Craven movies. The next movie I want to talk about is Sometimes They Come Back, which was a made-for-TV movie that was actually directed by Tom McLaughlin, who also directed Friday the 13th Part 6, and this is based on the short story by Stephen King of the same name, which was published in his collection Night Shift. Now, I have read the short story that this movie is based on, and this movie changes a lot from the original story because the story itself was only about maybe 15 to 20 pages long, and this is a full-length movie. But for a full-length movie based on a short story that was only about 20 pages long, the film is actually really damn good. This is honestly one of my favorite Stephen King adaptations, and I think it's one of the most underrated horror films of the 1990s. You might notice that I've shown a lot of Stephen King adaptations in this video. That's because there have been a lot of damn good Stephen King adaptations in the 1990s. Now, for some reason, this movie seemed to spawn a franchise. Like, you had the sequels, Sometimes They Come Back Again, which is on the same DVD, and then there was another one called Sometimes They Come Back for More, but neither sequel was anywhere near as good as the first one. The next movie I want to talk about is Demonic Toys, which I freaking love, and honestly, this might actually be my favorite of the early Full Moon movies, and I would even go as far as say that this might actually be better than the Puppet Master movies. The next movie I want to talk about is Dead Alive, which also goes by the title Braindead. Now, this is a horror comedy film that was co-written and directed by Peter Jackson, who prior to this directed movies like Bad Taste and Meet the Feebles, and after this would go on to do films like Heavenly Creatures, The Frighteners, and the Lord of the Rings movies. But Dead Alive is a freaking fantastic movie, and the film is gory as hell. Like, this is one of the goriest movies I've ever seen in my life, and I remember when I first saw this movie, I was just so taken aback by how gory the film is. Like, you have a scene in this movie where the zombies rip the ribcage right out of this guy's body. You have a scene where the zombies, like, rip the skin right off this guy's face and he's still screaming. There's also a scene where zombies eat this guy's entire lower half, except for the bones, and it's so freaking disgusting and cringeworthy, and I mean cringeworthy in a good way. But despite how gory and horrific a lot of the stuff in this movie is, the film's also hilarious as well. And honestly, even though I do like the Lord of the Rings movies, it's so hard for me to believe that the man who did this movie and Bad Taste would go on to do films like Heavenly Creatures and the Lord of the Rings and the King Kong remake. Like, he did a complete 180. The next movie I want to talk about is Candyman, which, as you can see, I don't have on DVD, I have it on VHS, and this VHS that I have was actually signed by Tony Todd. Now, Candyman is based on the short story by Clive Barker entitled The Forbidden. Now, I have read the short story, and the movie actually changes a lot from the original short story, and honestly, I think a lot of the changes that this movie made were for the better. Even though I do like the original short story, this movie added so much more social commentary into it, and really it's a much deeper and much more psychological film than you might be expecting. And unfortunately, this movie kind of gets lumped together with a lot of slasher films, and personally, I don't consider this to be a slasher film. To me, this is a psychological ghost film that has some slasher elements, but once again, it's a much deeper and much more psychological film than it's given credit for. In my opinion, this movie deserves to be ranked up there with stuff like The Exorcist and Jacob's Ladder and Silence of the Lambs. Once again, this is really a psychological horror film. The next movie I want to talk about is another film that I don't have on DVD, but I have it on VHS, and that is Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, of course, there have been countless different movies made based on the original novel by Bram Stoker, but this is really the only film that really does follow the book. And I'm not sure if I would say this is my favorite adaptation of Dracula, but it's definitely one of my favorites. The last movie I want to talk about for this part of the video, keep in mind that this video is going to be in 3 parts, but the last movie I want to talk about for this part of the video is Army of Darkness, which is the 3rd film in the Evil Dead series, and this is not really a horror film per se, and as I mentioned before, a lot of the time genre can be a matter of opinion, but even I wouldn't necessarily call this a horror film. This is much more of a fantasy comedy, but it is a sequel to Evil Dead and Evil Dead 2, which are very much horror films, so I'm including it in this video because it is part of a horror franchise, even though this movie itself is not really 100% horror. But Army of Darkness is a fantastic movie, and honestly, this might actually be my favorite of the Evil Dead series. I mean, arguably Evil Dead 2 is the best of the Evil Dead series, but in terms of my personal favorite, because there is a slight difference between best and personal favorite, and my personal favorite film of this series is this film. I absolutely love Army of Darkness. So I'm gonna end this video off here, and I'm going to continue with a part 2.